progress.
Hi, everybody. I'm Crystal Haynes. Tonight on Greater Boston, more than 100 arrests as Boston police crack down on Emerson College pro-Palestine protest encampments overnight. GBH News' Tori Bedford has been covering this story and joins me ahead on that, along with a Harvard student journalist who's been covering the encampment on her campus. Plus, while the NBA's top recruits are pulling in multi-million-dollar contracts, superstars like Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark will make around $70K in the WNBA. NBC Sports' Trenny Casey joins me on the pro sports pay gap and the Patriots' most important NFL draft in decades. Overnight, more than 100 people were arrested as Boston police tore down a pro-Palestinian encampment on Emerson's campus. Now, as you can see in this video, right here from NBC 10 Boston.
Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now!
These encampments have popped up at MIT, Harvard, and dozens of college campuses across the state and the country, all in reaction to the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Most notably at Columbia University, students have been camped out en masse since last week, and classes have been moved to remote for the remainder of the semester. Now, right here in Boston, the Emerson students arrested face charges of unlawful assembly. Now, GBH reporter Tori Bedford has been covering this story. You were inside the courtroom as those arraignments were supposed to happen. We also are joined with Azusa Lippett. She's a senior reporter with the Harvard Crimson and has been covering the protests on her campus. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Tori, I'm going to start with you. I mean, it seemed like over 100 students were going to be arraigned, but that didn't necessarily happen.
Well, 108 students were arrested overnight, so it was about 1:45 in the morning. In the preceding days, the college and the city had been in conversation about how to handle this encampment. You know, it's in this tiny little alleyway that is a public alleyway that connects then to an MBTA transportation building, so it's both state and city jurisdiction. They gave the students about a 10-minute warning, a dispersal warning, and then police came from both sides and cleared, you know, it was this very chaotic, violent clash, right? We know from the Boston police that 4 officers were injured, one seriously, non-life-threatening injuries, but some of the students were taken away in stretchers. We don't know the full extent of their injuries, but I've heard from multiple students that some have had some pretty severe injuries. So today, you know, 8 students were brought into Boston Municipal Court for arraignments, but there's actually a judge conference going on at BMC, and so those were postponed. But arraignments are going to be happening between as early as the 29th and then I think as late as May 7th. So they're kind of processing this 108 students and other protesters, not just students, who were involved in this disbursement, this sweep.
Yeah, there have been a lot of accounts on social media and other places about exactly what happened. In fact, we actually have a soundbite from a witness describing the police coming in and arresting students. So let's take a listen.
The big vans, they came in, they parked right in front of this alleyway, and the cops came out and they started arresting students, like forcing their way into the encampment and everything, pushing students to the ground. I saw one student get shoved into the pavement and then their hands forcefully pulled behind them.
Now, Tori, this encampment has been up for, well, I won't say some time, but at least a good amount of time. Yeah, a couple days. Yeah. I imagine a lot of folks are saying they're going to go right back to their protests and to their cause.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think there's already across the city and across Greater Boston, and I think connected to the larger national pro-Palestine movement, there are networks, right, where people are communicating, and I think they are hoping to return. What's tricky about Boston and about the Emerson campus, so I want to hear about how things are going at Harvard. Yeah. The Harvard campus, you know, they're on Harvard private property, right? At Emerson, you're right there in the middle of the city and you're on a public street. And so the city issued an ordinance, Mayor Michelle Wu issued an ordinance last year that banned camping, like encampments, and it was designed around homeless encampments. But I think that it was mentioned, she made comments today, and there was a statement from Emerson's president, Jay Bernhardt, that also acknowledged the violation of the city ordinance law in having these encampments out. So this is a sort of complicated issue where, the police are coming in. I think just today we saw Northeastern police coming in to break up an encampment. And at Emerson, when they were coming in, there were state officers there as well. They're coming in to break up an encampment both at the school, but also on city property. So I don't know, what kind of the future holds in terms of the encampment returning, but right now I think the focus for this movement, for the organizers, is to kind of work on getting through the arraignment process, and then, their goal, which I think, we've had so many conversations about these college protests,
right, exactly.
And I think they're really important, and the ACLU came out against the arrests in a statement today, but I think that it's also important to just remember why the students are doing this in the first place, and that they're protesting the Israeli government and their institutions' connection to other places that support the Israeli government. So they wanted transparency on the college's endowment, and they wanted divestment from any companies that work with the Israeli government, the IDF, weapons manufacturing, that kind of thing.
Azusa, I'd love to talk about what's happening on Harvard, because I know many folks have been following it closely, especially since Claudine Gay called to resign, leaving that school, the conflict sort of escalating to some degree on Harvard's campus, and now the public being closed out. What has been the temperature on Harvard's campus through your reporting?
Right. Thank you so much. This is definitely a developing story. I want to say I'm incredibly proud of the news staff over at the Harvard Crimson. We've been putting out time-stamped blog-style live updates ever since the encampment started yesterday, Wednesday afternoon, around 12:30 p.m. And going forward, 24 hours a day, though we aren't sure how long the encampment will last. Some reporters will be there on the ground out there. I will say, from what we have seen on the ground, although certainly maybe there's going to be some students who are opposed to the encampment protest, on the ground we have seen a largely very peaceful occupation of Harvard Yard. There's currently about 35 tents pitched right in front of the well-visited John Harvard statue. And there's music playing from the tents. There's programming like teach-ins about student activism and Palestine. And about 5 times a day, they have been having an opportunity for Muslim student protesters to gather and have sort of a makeshift tent for privacy in routine daily prayers.
We've been talking about the importance of the student reporting on these particular issues. I know Columbia made headlines for sure about their handling, or in some cases, some people may say mishandling, of what's been happening on campus there with the freedom of speech and the upholding of that. As a student journalist yourself, when you see something like Columbia where they just sweep out the students and change their policies to sort of perhaps silence some groups or quell what's happening there on campus, what goes through your mind as someone who is also reporting on it as well?
Well, I will say, since the college restricted Harvard Yard access on Sunday to only Harvard ID holders, it has been especially critical for us to really be there at all times and be able to share with our readers timely and accurate reports of events as they've been unfolding. And we've found that to be really critical for both our Harvard readership and nationwide.
Is this dividing the campus?
Again, as I said, I'm sure some students may be upset about the encampment protest, but again, as we have been seeing on the ground, we're in a reading week before final exams begin, and students have largely just been passing by the encampment on foot on their way to study for those exams.
Yeah, we know finals week, very important as well. Tori, we've been watching this unfold across the country, and we also know that this is not only just a civic issue or a social issue for folks. We know it's a political issue, in folks in Capitol Hill weighing in on this conversation, especially in the Columbia case, and then, of course, in the testimonies of the MIT former president, or MIT president, the former president of Harvard, and the like. I mean, is there a sense that there's also the public wanting to join in on these demonstrations to sort of assert their thought or viewpoint on all of this?
I mean, I think we've seen, it's interesting that only ID holders are allowed to interact with this encampment or even go near it, right? Because Harvard Yard is usually this place that's full of tourists and people just kind of passing through, somebody having a picnic. At Emerson, you know, it was similar, very peaceful, and a lot of the faculty, you know, I spoke to faculty who were there in support of the students who had been arrested at the courthouse today. I think a lot of the faculty really stand with the students, and a number of people who were arrested are not currently students. Some are alumni, you know, some are just people from the community who are concerned and who wanted to be involved. So I do think that obviously these things are very contentious, very political, very controversial, but I do think that there are, you know, in a broader sense, you know, there are people now, I've spoken to activists who've been at this kind of for a long time. This conflict is not new, and have said that there are people who have never been politically active before in their lives, have never thought to call their representatives, who are now really motivated, and they are making these calls, they're joining these movements. Like, for the first time ever, they are coming out and becoming more active because they really feel this push to do something.
I'm curious about like the national discourse around freedom of speech, especially on college campuses, where, you know, that's the place where you learn about the causes that are important to you. You express your opinions about those. You're learning about yourself in general. I imagine a lot of students and faculty and folks like that were commenting on how Columbia was trying to sort of, what some would argue, quell some of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the issue, right, that we keep getting caught up in, and I think it's a really important one. And when we look at the history of protests on college campuses, we look at Kent State, we think about protests against Vietnam, we think about, I mean, you know, you and I, before we went on camera, were just talking about things we covered as student journalists, and I want to commend you because that is always the best source when things like this happen. Everybody has to cite the student journalists. They are on the ground. They know what's happening. They wake up for that 2 a.m. sweep. Like, they are there, right? And it's incredible, real coverage. But you're doing an amazing job. But I think, yeah, there's a history of this. And I think that it kind of ebbs and flows. But if we look at other countries as well, I mean, protests in the streets over government changes, like there are places in Europe where if they try to raise tuition by, you know, €100, people are going to be out marching in the streets, right? I think that it is, you know, it's a fundamental right. You know, it's our First Amendment right. And then it gets kind of muddied with things like ordinance laws and, you know, the colleges trying to handle the conflict, right, where there are student groups, Israeli student groups or Jewish student groups that they feel unsafe with the presence of this. Right. And then there are Jewish student groups that are in support of pro-Palestinian student groups. I mean, there's just such a huge conflict right now. And I think the way that colleges at large are handling this, like, it's really important to look at the decisions that they make from the perspective of these as learning institutions and not just money-making facilities, you know. Yeah, absolutely, and certainly something we'll continue to cover. We'll be following your coverage and, of course, your coverage as well. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese are two of the biggest names in America right now, and their college careers have done wonders for women's sports, drawing millions more March Madness viewers than the men's tournament for the first time in NCAA history. But the fame hasn't translated to fortune, at least in the WNBA. Clark and Reese will make around $76,000 and $73,000 a year, respectively, compared to San Antonio Spurs rookie Victor Wembanyama, who made over $12 million this year. NBC Sports Boston anchor and reporter Trenny Casey joins me now to discuss all of this. Certainly, those numbers don't seem equitable, but as my husband and all of his friends and the folks tuned in say, they just have this argument that women don't draw as much as the men.
Well, I don't agree with that argument as much anymore, Crystal. I think that was the issue in the past, which is why we are still sitting in a time where you see such massive disparity in the numbers, right? But we have seen big gains in women's sports in terms of viewership numbers. You talked about in your lead in there about the college basketball, how they outrated the men's final this year in terms of television ratings. WNBA saw an increase in ratings last year. The problem is that increase has just more recently come, right? So now I think the thing we need to talk about is how does the WNBA, how does women's college basketball, how do they capitalize and keep this momentum going? Because that is going to turn into the fortune that you're talking about that they don't have right now.
Yeah, I'm always saying that in these arguments that they're just one, hotshot marketing professional away from like creating these stories which will fill the seats of these arenas for women's basketball games.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, just look at Caitlin Clark. It's why there's so much of an emphasis, I think, on her in particular, because there were other stars in women's college basketball. She didn't carry the season herself, but she is ubiquitous this year. You see her in State Farm commercials, Nike commercials, Gatorade. She just signed a deal with Nike for $28 million over the next 10 years, plus a signature shoe deal. Like, she is a storyline that people have followed. And it started last year in the finals when Iowa played LSU. Angel Reese and her kind of had the back and forth. Did they act like ladies enough? Did they handle themselves the right way on the court? All of those drove up viewership this year. That's what's important. People always identify, listen, if you like sports, you like sports. But what people really identify with is a hero, a villain, a storyline, and getting to know the people who are on the court. The NBA, starting really in the Magic Bird and then definitely in the Michael Jordan area, that's where they saw a huge increase in television revenue and just revenue overall. And then in turn, salaries, because that's, people got obsessed with, I want to be like Mike. Can Caitlin Clark be the Michael Jordan of the WNBA? Maybe not to that extent, but I think that's what the WNBA and women professional athletes in all sports are hoping for.
I know that this is a conversation that has been happening since, the Women's World Cup and all of the viewers and then the pay equity in soccer there, the conversation. Do we see in the near future, do you think that there'll be another serious conversation about raising the salaries in the WNBA?
Absolutely, because everything is cyclical, right? There are television deals that are signed and collective bargaining agreements that are signed and agreed upon in professional sports. Women, that's where there is equality in both women's and men's. The women's collective bargaining agreement can be renegotiated after this season. So you can expect, I would imagine, the players' union and the WNBA to have a tougher conversation this time around. And the WNBA is also going to have a chance to renegotiate their television rights. They're going to be able to go to networks like NBC or ESPN, TNT, the networks that now have their games, Amazon, and say, hey, look at these numbers. Look at the product that we're putting out there. People are paying attention. They're buying merchandise. Advertisers, sponsors are going to be more inclined to invest money, I think, in the future. That, in turn, is going to mean more money for these female athletes, because that's really the crux of it, right? It's not that if the WNBA had, the coffers that the NBA has or the NFL, they would love to pay their stars what an NBA star makes. They just don't have the revenue. Like right now, the WNBA last year pulled in about $180 to $200 million in total revenue. And their sponsorships are folded into that. You look at they had about $75 million in sponsorships. You even look at MLS, Major League Soccer. They had over $600 million last year in sponsorships alone. So it's those other dollars coming into sports, people investing in the sports and the athletes. And then you see the change happening with the salaries.
Trini, I'm going to take advantage of you while we have you. NFL draft. It's do or die for the Pats.
Number 3 pick, biggest draft since Drew Bledsoe went number 1 overall back in 1993. This is huge. Everybody expected expects them to take a quarterback at number 3 to stay right there. The consensus is they think they'll take North Carolina quarterback Drake May, but keep an eye on what Washington does. The Washington Commanders have the number 2 pick overall. Everyone has sort of assumed they'll take LSU quarterback Jaden Daniels, but if for some reason there were some conversations the last week or so that maybe Jaden Daniels himself and his camp, his agents, his parents, the whole thing that he has around him, maybe rubs some people in Washington the wrong way. If for some reason they would go with Drake May, then maybe you could see Jaden Daniels, who many people believe is more NFL ready, come to the Patriots instead. But either way, they're looking for a franchise quarterback. They didn't get it with Mac Jones. They need to get it here. Listen, I don't watch a ton of college football. I'm going to be totally honest, but all the very smart football guys I'm around every day tell me Drake May is the way to go. Lower floor, but a much higher ceiling than Jaden Daniels. He could be a real star in the NFL.
We certainly need a better season, that's for sure.
Yes, please.
All right, Trenny Casey, thank you so much.
You got it.
That's it for tonight, but come back tomorrow for Talking Politics. Adam Riley and his panel will dig into the political consequences for MassDOT Secretary Monica Tibbetts Nutt, who faced a wave of outrage for floating the idea of border tolls. Plus, activists push back against new plans for White Stadium. That and more tomorrow at 7. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Crystal Haynes. We'll leave you tonight with a song from Alston-based band Winkler, who recently performed on Boston Public Radio ahead of their May 10th show at Rockwood Music Hall. You can find them at winklerband.com. Here they are. Good night.
Well, I'm in danger. I never knew till I found you. You're the danger, that's some true shit. Look around you. I'm a ranger on a blue hill in the pale moon. You're the fire, now I'm the ashes. You burn me down too. Burn me down too. Guardian angel, let the truth in. Glad I found you. I'm a river, you're the ocean that I'm bound to. I'm a sailor, you're the siren I could drown to. I could drown to.
Celtic. 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 I don't even know what that means anymore. For years, English speakers pronounced this word with a soft C in all contexts. It's how people in the UK said it in the late 19th century when the famed Glasgow soccer team, Celtic, was formed. And it's how people around here said it in 1947 when our local basketball team debuted. Now, this makes all the sense in the world. In English, when the letter C is followed by an E, it's essentially always said like an S. Think cement, cell phone, race, and dance. Now, as for why that is, we have to go back, way back, to the time of gladiators, chariot races, etc. Or should I say, et cetera.
Latin didn't have a K. The C was the Latin reflex of the Greek kappa.
And so, in classical Latin, that letter C was always pronounced K. Latin, of course, would form the basis for numerous other languages, including Italian, French, and Spanish, known today as the Romance languages. And as Latin evolved, so too did the way the letter C was pronounced.
What happened was that K just doesn't stay K all the time.
How come?
Consonants are determined by voice, place, and manner, and a K is a voiceless back stop.
When followed by a U, like in the word cut, that voiceless back stop of the K remains pretty easy to pull off. But it gets a little harder to do when it's followed by an I, like Killington, or an E, like Kendall Square. Now, over time, that began to impact that hard C.
It's just a phonological process that takes place fairly organically over a course of centuries. It's a place assimilation, and that place assimilation leads to lenition, which is to say weakening, a softening. It just makes it a little less hard.
This is exactly what happened as Italian developed. When the C is followed by an E, the K became a ch. The word celebrate in Italian, celebrare. And perhaps you've enjoyed a nice after-dinner limoncello in the North End. Now, in French, the C sound went even a step further when followed by an E, all the way to S. This is even easier on the mouth. Think C'est la vie, or the painter, Paul Cézanne. Nice and soft is how one William the Conqueror would have preferred his CEs when he and his Norman army invaded England in the 11th century.
The Norman conquest, 1066 and all that, brought French big style over to England.
Not only did William take over England, but for a while, he made French the official language of the land. This would permanently alter the still developing English language in numerous ways, including the adoption of a soft C before the letter E.
Anglo-Norman was basically the version of French that became current in England, to the extent that a lot of the nobility of England were speaking a variety of French.
But that French influence did not extend to the various other languages spoken around the British Isles in places like Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. Languages of the Celts.
Irish got its alphabet from Latin. It didn't get its alphabet by way of French from Latin. It just got its alphabet from monks writing using the Latin alphabet. The letter K is not a letter in the Irish alphabet. The C, not just in Latin, but also in the Celtic languages, is pronounced K everywhere.
So, the rules of modern English suggest that this word should be said with a soft C. And for a long time, that's how English speakers said it. But that has changed since the mid-20th century. In recent decades, there have been ongoing efforts by many English speakers to try and pronounce words and names from other languages the way that they would have us pronounce them.
Guess what? Now we're feeling bad about all that empire, and we're raising our consciousness, and we're like, oh yes, no, we have to keep the other pronunciations of all the words we've stolen.
But the sports world is notorious for holding fast to tradition.
Celtic, Celtic, Celtic.
And so, while we've adjusted our pronunciation of the word Celtic when talking about music or language or culture, it should be no surprise that the two places the legacy of Celtic with a soft C live on is with a soccer team in Scotland and a basketball team right here in Boston.
On pool